management in issues of land insecurity, displacement, grassroots social movements in Philippines, and she has published in many international journals, and she also holds a PhD from the London School of Economics. Today's presentation is going to be in English, but you can ask questions in Spanish, always in the Facebook Live transmission, or in English if you prefer. And we will ask to our guests. So welcome, Jordana. Thank you for being here. For us as the Institute of Housing, it's an honor to have you here. Without any further presentation, you can start.
Gracias, Pablo, and buenas tardes, y muchas gracias por acompañarnos a todos, y a Pablo y Fernando por la invitación. As Pablo said, hoy hablaré en inglés porque no tengo mucha confianza en mi español, pero Pablo me ayudó a traducir las diapositivas, así que espero que no sea demasiado difícil seguir la presentación. Bueno. I will be making a case in today's presentation. Thank you, Pablo. Cool. So yes, I will be making a case today, as indicated in the title, for considering the everyday within evaluations of the exceptional. And I'm arguing that this offers a practical means of engendering disaster risk reduction and management. And this is based on my ongoing research in the Philippines, exploring urban risk and resilience, as well as displacement and how these processes and dynamics are all tied together, as Pablo mentioned. And I'm going to begin by giving you a little bit of background on the context of gender and disasters in the Philippines before sharing some insights from my fieldwork with you. And then I'm going to conclude with my theoretical arguments. So I'm kind of working backwards, if that makes sense. All right, next slide, please, Pablo. Great. So the topic of risk and resilience is especially pertinent to current times where people around the world find themselves in a particularly pronounced state of uncertainty about what the future holds. And this is largely due to the coronavirus pandemic and its many impacts on every aspect of our lives. And for many, this sense of being or feeling at risk might seem rather new. But for many others, and perhaps even the majority of others, the pandemic, though especially pronounced because of its globality, very much falls within a broader trajectory of risk and insecurity that characterizes their everyday lives. And I think this is especially the case for those regions, cities, and people of the world where poverty, war, extrajudicial violence, forced displacement, climate change, and environmental hazards are a tangible part of their everyday or immediate realities, as opposed to something that simply exists within the realm of some potential or unknown future. Next slide, please. And the Philippines is one such country to which this applies. And that's largely due to its location in the West Pacific, as well as its kind of geomorphology. But for these combined factors, the Philippines routinely experiences a whole host of climatic and environmental hazards, including typhoons, earthquakes, landslides, and so on. And for this reason, it's considered one of the most disaster-affected countries in the world. Next slide, please, Pablo. Thank you. Thanks. So my research is based in Metro Cebu, which is the second largest urban center in the Philippines after Metro Manila. And it has a population of just under 3 million people, approximately 200,000 of whom are estimated to be living in informal settlements. And my research focused on 5 informal settlements, which were considered danger zones because of their vulnerability to flooding, fires, landslides, or storm surge. Next slide, please. And although these settlements are located on land typically deemed undesirable by those with alternatives, rapid urbanization coupled with severe land shortages and an increasingly competitive landscape of commercial and property development has made land tenure insecurity one of the most pressing concerns for the urban poor of Metro Cebu. And within this context of multiple and overlapping forms of risk and insecurity, many urban poor communities have started organizing themselves in the interest of building local capacities to resist the different threats that they're facing. And these organizations often take the form of homeowner associations. And I'll speak a little bit more about homeowner associations shortly. But I think what's notable is that in Cebu, as elsewhere in the Philippines, women are very much at the helm of these organizing efforts. They're the most involved. And the research that I'll be sharing with you today set out with the intention of understanding, firstly, the perspectives and experiences of the women and men who were living in these so-called danger zones, and also to try to uncover the causes and consequences of feminized participation in these community organizations and related risk management activities. And just to briefly touch on the methods so that you have some context of who I was speaking to, my findings are based on in-depth photo voice interviews and life story narratives with 44 individuals, 65% of whom were women, as well as focus group discussions with 61 individuals, and 60% of the focus group participants were female. So that gives you, I tried to work with as much of a gender balance as I could, but I spoke to more women. All right, next slide, please, Pablo. Thank you. So before I get into depth on my findings, I think it's helpful to offer some context on gender and disasters in the Philippines, but I'll start with gender. So the country carries a reputation for being the most gender equitable country in the Asian and Pacific region, and one of the most gender equitable countries in the world, according to the Global Gender Gap Index, which measures countries on their progress towards gender parity through economic participation and opportunity, education, health, and political empowerment. And it's ranked in the top 10 of this index since the measure began in 2006, but quite noticeably in 2020 dropped 8 places to its current position of 16, largely due to a decline in female representation in the cabinet under the Duterte administration. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in following the forthcoming elections. In terms of education and economic participation, women in the Philippines are more likely than men to enroll in secondary and tertiary education, and consequently also outnumber men in senior and leadership roles, as well as in professional and technical professions, which is something that only 4 other countries in the world have actually managed to achieve. Next slide, please. But when you break these figures down to incorporate the experiences and opportunities of the female population as a whole, it becomes quite clear that women remain very much in a disadvantaged position. They're more prone to vulnerable employment in the informal economy and are more likely to receive lower wages than men in almost all occupations, including in female-dominated service and export manufacturing sectors. And sometimes they're paid between 40 and 50% less than their male counterparts for doing the same job. And this is even higher in the informal economy. Next slide, please. Women are also less likely than men to own property, and in the context of reproductive rights are unable to access legal abortions or to get divorced. And this has in many ways contributed to the country's high levels of maternal mortality and high rates of domestic violence. And so I think what I'm trying to show here is that there's a real paradox in the sort of gender equality landscape that exists in the Philippines, which makes it a really interesting place to look at gender and gender relations more generally. Next slide, please, Pablo. I'm going to shift the focus slightly here to speak about disasters and gender within that context. So the Philippines, kind of similar to its accolades around gender, is also considered a role model in disaster risk management and gender mainstreaming within this sector. And this is not only in relation to its Southeast Asian neighbors, but globally. And as mentioned earlier, I think part of this comes from the fact that across the country, women are the main participants in community-based disaster risk management initiatives. And I think that this comes to some extent from the kind of relative advancement of gender awareness and mainstreaming efforts in the Philippines compared with many other disaster-affected countries. However, despite the visible and active presence of women in community-based disaster risk management, what's interesting is that state-level discourse continues to frame them first and foremost as victims. An example of this is in the Philippines Disaster Risk Management Act of 2010, where women are identified as vulnerable and marginalized groups alongside the elderly, ethnic minorities, and people with disabilities. And rather worryingly, women's access to gender-specific support and assistance during and post-disasters appears to be predicated around motherhood, with local governments encouraged to create a special place where internally displaced mothers can find help with breastfeeding, feeding care for their babies, and give support to each other. And while I think these provisions for nursing mothers are very important and welcome, what I'd argue is that the wider effects of unequal care burdens, gender divisions of labor, violence, and insecurity on both women and men's health and well-being during and post-disasters becomes very subsumed and neglected by this narrow optic. Next slide, please. Now, with this as a context, I'd like to share some of my findings about the gender perceptions and experiences of disaster risk and gender participation in risk management activities. I think perhaps one of the most interesting things for me that came to light very early on in my research was that despite living in areas classified as danger zones due to their vulnerability to disasters, it actually wasn't the large-scale catastrophic events that we traditionally think of as disasters, which preoccupied residents, but rather it was the everyday risks associated with poverty, land tenure insecurity, and a lack of access to infrastructure, which concerned respondents the most. And for both men and women, this threat of demolition and eviction in particular was the primary reason that they joined or formed a homeowner association, because they felt that by doing so and sort of like formally registering their existence, they wouldn't be as easily displaced without some kind of relocation support or financial compensation. And interestingly, though not entirely surprisingly, land tenure insecurity was very closely connected with events traditionally conceived of as disasters. And this was especially so in the case of floods and fires. Next slide, please. And an example of this is that I think it comes through in this quote, but fires were without a doubt the most feared of climate-related or climate-exacerbated risks that respondents spoke to me about, and were often a precursor to eviction, with many people telling me stories of suspected arson, especially on privately owned plots of land, where landowners would use the exodus preceding the fire as an opportunity to fence off the area and prevent residents from re-entering and rebuilding, as indicated by this quote here, which for those that don't speak Spanish is basically saying that, you know, we've been evicted, 3 times, once after the first fire, once after the second, and again in 2012, which was the more recent fire. Next slide, please. In Metro Cebu, as elsewhere in the country, the municipal governments are also undertaking the massive task of clearing informal settlements located along waterways, and they're doing this within their disaster risk management plans. And I think a lot of the kind of urban brochures and kind of the propaganda around these projects, as I've depicted on this slide here, are really being used to sort of legitimize the erasure of informal settlements from the city. And although the threat of demolition and eviction was very much a concern expressed by both male and female respondents, land tenure insecurity appeared to present a greater source of worry and anxiety for women than for men, which my findings suggest is at least partially attributed to their heightened sense of economic insecurity and financial dependency. And I go into more depth on this in one of my papers, which I've shared with you as part of these slides, but happy to speak about this more in more depth in the question and answers. Next slide, please. Now, hazards relating to waste disposal, such as flooding because of blocked drains, dengue, waterborne illnesses, and environmental contamination, which were all pervasive challenges across the 5 communities that I was working in, also seemed to preoccupy women more than men. And this was indicated by the frequency with which these issues came up in discussions. And on the other hand, men expressed particular concern over aspects of physical and material infrastructure, such as electricity, water, and roads and transportation links. And, they spoke about this in the context of the impacts that these infrastructural deficiencies had on their livelihoods and income generating potential. And while women also spoke of these issues, their concerns tended to revolve more around the health, safety, and well-being of their children and partners. And I think these differences in how women and men speak about and internalize risk and insecurity make a lot of sense when we consider them in relation to gender roles, identity, and mobility. Women are typically more confined to the domestic realm in, filling their reproductive and productive roles. And they also have gendered identities that are very much tied to the home environment. So I think their interest in issues that threaten the home environment or are perceived to threaten that environment it's of little surprise. But what I'm arguing is that these subtle gender differences in perceptions of and exposure to risk are intrinsically connected with gendered participation in the homeowner association. So these are the reasons why we see more women participating in risk management activities. And I'll go into a bit more depth on that now. But before I do, if you go to the next slide, please. I think this quote here that I want to share with you really sort of speaks to the subtle nuances that come through that came through some of the respondent narratives. And so this particular quote is from a female respondent that had twice lost her home to a fire. And in recent months, around the time that I was speaking to her, the threat of the fire was heightened because a local private developer was developing an adjacent lot and had blocked off the area around the settlement that she lived in. So I was asking her how she was managing under the circumstances, and she told me, when I go out, I don't go to places that are far from my home. So if there's an emergency, I can go back and save my things and take care of my children. And actually, her tactic of staying close to home was not unique to her. And I think it sheds light on the kind of direct and indirect ways in which fire risk and land tenure insecurity are interacting with one another to limit female mobility, with much bigger implications on women's well-being and just more generally gendered access to economic and social opportunities. Next slide, please. Now, in order to be officially registered and kind of legally recognized as an association, the homeowner associations need to elect officers, such as like a president, a vice president, a treasurer, a secretary, and so on, who serve as representatives for their communities in negotiation with the government. And what was interesting is that in all except for one of my study sites, these 11 to 12 officers were almost entirely women. And although homeowner association officers are volunteers who choose to participate and offer their time and labor, I say the word choose in quotations, and I'll go into more depth on that shortly, but I think it's important to note that there were quite clear gender differences in the ways in which women and men participate and the kinds of labors that they're involved in within the association. And I argue that these are very much a reflection of gendered stereotypes and power hierarchies in several regards. I think that's depicted by this quote here, which is basically speaking to, it's saying like the reason that more women than men participate in the association is because they're more patient, they're more able to kind of line up at City Hall and wait for hours on end to speak to someone from the government. And this woman who was an officer said she couldn't imagine her husband, queuing up in the same way. So I think that speaks again to the ways in which kind of gendered socialization is affecting people's participation in these groups. And actually this was most acutely apparent in Bayanihan activities. If you could go to the next slide, please, Pablo. Now, Bayanihan is a Tagalog term that pertains to the spirit of cooperation and collective action. And examples of Bayanihan include communal efforts to gather and clear garbage from the local neighborhood, as well as building and repairing public infrastructure such as roads or toilets. And although participation in Bayanihan is a mandated responsibility of association members, so you're supposed to do that as part of your membership. And if you're unable to attend, you're expected to contribute financially to snacks or materials in lieu of your labor. However, as is often the case, these collective burdens and duties are rarely shared, and more often than not tended to fall on women, especially in the waste clearing activities, which were both the most common and arguably the least appealing forms of Bayanihan that the homeowner associations were involved in. Interestingly, however, Bayanihan that was oriented around more stereotypically male domains, such as road and housing construction or infrastructure maintenance, notably attracted more male participants, although women were still very much present, either as laborers, as shown in this photograph here, or in the background doing the cooking. And on this point, if we can move to the next slide, please. I wanted to share with you another quote from a female respondent. I'm going to just leave you some time to read through this, but in essence, it's speaking again to this subtle undertone of like men not getting involved in cleaning activities. And I think it's poignant when this respondent says it's like the men become women, or weak, I think is what she was meaning there. When it comes time to clean, it's like they're not able to do it, but and she's saying it's just because they don't want to do it. So it's starting to allude to this notion of choice that's really affecting people's involvement in the association. And I think drawing on these examples and many others, we can see that gender participation in Bayanihan and in the association more generally is playing out to reproduce power hierarchies based on stereotypes that designate specific domains or duties to women and men. And this very much extends to traditional disaster risk management activities, including post-disaster emergency response teams, which attract significantly more male participants than other association activities, especially in the search and rescue functions, where actually those involved are almost entirely male, while women conversely make up the majority of first aid and camp management volunteers who treat and assess local needs and injuries after a disaster and tend to have responsibilities that are more in the background and that continue long after the disaster event itself. So thinking about this collectively, I think these local resilience building activities seem to reflect what Sylvia Chantis termed a feminization of responsibility and obligation. And here she's speaking to the process where traditional gender roles and female-oriented norms of altruism, for example, are being perpetuated by development programs, or in this case, like community-based disaster risk management programs, to the effect that poor women are becoming kind of liable or responsible for meeting certain development targets rather than necessarily benefiting from them, so to speak. Next slide, please. And kind of along this vein, it was very clear in speaking with homeowner association officers that participation in the association came with many personal costs. And this was for both male and female officers, but as I said, the majority of officers were women. And the majority of those that I interviewed had been serving in their association in one capacity or another for years. And in several cases, had actually instigated the establishment of these organizations. And because the association is entirely dependent on the initiative, investment, and vision of its local leaders, those people who demonstrate a commitment and can show that they're making achievements get reelected. And sometimes this is despite their best efforts to stand down and let someone else take over, as indicated in this top quote here from a female officer. She's a mother of 7 who's been involved, very, very active in the association for years, and wanted to step down, but said that she doesn't have a choice because basically she says, they'll find me anywhere, they'll move the meetings around. If I say that I can't attend, they won't take no for an answer. So she just gave up and continues to serve. And of course, she continues to do a wonderful job. Interestingly, many of the men that I spoke with in the community more generally, who were members of the association, if not officers, also felt that women were better suited to being officers because in addition to the massive time investment that is connected with these volunteer roles, women were deemed more literate, more diplomatic, and better able to resolve conflicts. And these were all skills that were considered really important to fulfilling leadership roles in the association. However, as this bottom quote suggests, although many men might feel less confident about their ability to fill the role, in this case, the individual said it was not literate and kind of struggled to engage, for example, or to feel confident engaging with government level documents. What also comes through is that men are very aware of the extensive time and labor burdens required of officers, and so are choosing to opt out of these responsibilities. And I think this is an interesting dynamic for us to be mindful of when we are thinking about engendering disaster risk management, because quite often we take participation to be a sign of gender empowerment. So when lots of women are present, we take this as an unquestionably good thing without necessarily looking at the power dynamics that underpin these trends. Next slide, please. To complicate things a little bit more, I'd like to also highlight that many female respondents, while speaking of the costs and burdens and responsibilities of being an officer, also described their participation in the association using a language of empowerment. Many of them told me about how their participation in the association gave them a sense of self-worth, expanded their knowledge, mobility, and confidence, helped them develop skills to build social networks, make political contacts. And all of this, they felt, really contributed to a growth in their sense of agency and independence. A couple of the women that I came to know went on to secure employment, sometimes in government or local NGOs. Others left abusive partners on the back of kind of speaking with other women in the association or learning kind of new skills or about the law, again, through these networks. And others still managed to renegotiate divisions of household labor to free up their time for other activities, be that within the association or eventually when they started working. So these transformative accounts certainly don't reflect everyone's experiences, and I don't think they should be romanticized, but I think they also shouldn't be dismissed because they reflect several very tangible and important outcomes for the women and families concerned. So we see this dynamic of participation having a lot of perhaps unintended positive effects, while also having several costs. So next slide, please, Pablo. To draw this presentation to a close, I think respondent testimonies really highlight the subjective and gendered experiences of risk and the various ways in which gender identities, disadvantages, and distributions of labor exacerbate people's actual and perceived sense of vulnerability. It also, I think my findings also reveal the significance of the everyday in considerations of the exceptional. And I use the term exceptional, in relation to exceptional events, such as the way we think about disasters more traditionally. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the chronic stresses associated with poverty tend to present a much greater source of stress and vulnerability to people's livelihoods and well-being than events that are traditionally conceived of as disasters. And it's on this basis that I'm arguing that a focus on hazards over the ways in which risks and disasters are understood and experienced actually leads to the privileging of technical expertise and solutions over local knowledge and experience. And it also neglects the kind of multiple ways in which risk is embodied, as well as the labors that contribute to risk management or resilience building, which are often invisible within these more technical kind of lenses and ways of viewing risk and resilience. My findings also emphasize, I think, the dangers of depicting community-based disaster risk management or risk management more generally as politically neutral. And the reason for this is because I've shown that participation is very much shaped by existing norms and power relations that are premised around gender stereotypes, perceptions of vulnerabilities, and exposure to different types of risks. And Within this, I would say that considering the everyday in evaluations of the exceptional holds valuable potential as a practical means of engendering disaster resilient scholarship, because it draws attention to those power hierarchies that might otherwise go unnoticed, and reveals the hidden labors that we've spoken about. So yeah, we can speak a little bit more perhaps about the methods within that. Last slide, please. So as we reflect on the opportunities of the current moment, I think there's a lot of discussion. COP26 is going on at the moment, and we're all kind of thinking about how to create more sustainable urban futures. I think it's really vital that we recognize the continuum between social reproduction in times of crisis and the material and ideological conditions that restrict women and other marginalized groups in everyday life. And secondly, and perhaps less obviously, we need to recognize that housing justice, climate justice, and gender justice are all really intimately connected, and acknowledge the centrality of housing and gendered practices of care to urban resilience. So yeah, I think I've got a good audience for that here, given the group that you guys are all part of. And finally, I think something for us to think about, both as academics and as practitioners, is how we create space for diverse perspectives to be heard within our research, and to really drive our research and practice, so that we know that the knowledge that we're producing and contributing to is grounded in people's actual priorities rather than on assumptions about what matters. So on that note, I will leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. Gracias.
Thank you, Jordana, for such a wonderful presentation. We have many questions already in our chat. But I would like to start by asking you a question about how managing everyday risk may spill over not only on worries, fears, but as well, if you want, on the integration of women into work, the opportunities that they have about recreation and education. Because in one of the cases that you mentioned about this woman that is staying around the house, and if you read some of your papers, these are informal settlements that don't have many job and educational opportunities themselves. So I guess that triggers a whole set of other consequences.
Yeah.
So that is the first one. And I would like to, as well, if you can get a little bit deeper somehow now, and I think it's because of time, you speak about gender on essentially men and female as large broad categories. And I was wondering if your study could distinguish some of the intersectionalities that there is in that issue. You distinguish some of, let's say, people that are empowered by community participation and people that feel obliged to do so. But I guess one of the challenges of qualitative work, because of the number and so on, is how much of the intersectional perspective you can bring on, still making sense and making a compelling story.
Thank you so much for those questions. And I'm going to take them in reverse order. So I'll answer the second one first, because I think it speaks to your first question. In terms of intersectionality, I think very explicitly, my work engages with gender as a binary, which is not the way that I see gender, but under the basis of where I was doing research, that's what I was kind of looking at. I was looking at gender, but also gender intersecting with class. So I was focusing specifically on informal settlements, as I mentioned, so I don't have huge insights into kind of what these dynamics are like in middle and upper income areas. But now kind of linking this with your first question around the situated or the geographic factors that specific to informal settlements that contribute to gendered exposure to risk. I think they're intimately connected, because if you're staying around the house, as I mentioned, if you have to take care of kids, or if you're limited in your ability to kind of to get employment, either because you don't have an education or because the kinds of opportunities are limited to you on the basis of your gender in the informal sector kind of space, you're going to be more exposed to all the hazards that are in your immediate environment. And a lot of men are coming in and out of the settlements, so their exposure to things like water pollution, air pollution, and so on are less, just because they're leaving, while also making more contacts with people, having greater mobility. So I think like that's how gender kind of plays out in informal settlements. People, women tend to be stuck. They can't get out as easily as men because of norms, economic opportunities, and so on. Around the kind of intersectional question, the kinds of men and women that were more likely to participate, and this goes for both men and women, something that I'd like to look into a bit more, which definitely had an impact on people taking an initiative, was role models. So this came through in the life story narrative. So most of the people that really took an initiative to kind of lead their community spoke to me about, more often it was an older family member or family friend who they had seen when they were young, who was really active in a particular space, or active in the church, or, did things for their neighbors. If they were farmers, they'd share the produce. And it was this kind of role modeling of collective behaviors that contributed to their sense of wanting to give back to the community. So it's an odd way of thinking about intersectionality. But if we just think broadly about what are the kind of dimensions of difference, or the factors that affect people's behavior or propensity to participate, that alongside gender and class was definitely apparent, and something I want to look into more.
Great, thank you, Jordana. Let me go for one of the questions that I have here in the chat. So there is one, since that you mentioned the methodology, and there is one related with that asks, how did you initially approach these communities, focusing on the main difficulties and challenges from a feminist and post-colonial approach? And I think that is a key question that not only regard your fieldwork, but many of the fieldwork that we do every day, and can be between the global north and the south, and even within a country by essentially academics is highly concentrated by people that have essentially high income, high education, and how you can be sure that you are bringing the discourses not only that you are interested on researching, but also the ones that come from the communities, and the one that they want to bring on board.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question. I think I'm very mindful of those dynamics, and I, as someone who was quite new to the Philippines when I was interested in looking at this topic. So speaking really candidly, like how I approached this was through multiple visits, meeting with lots of people, lots of different organizations, NGOs, academics, like as many people who would speak to me as possible. I spoke to them, and I made contact with an NGO in Cebu whose politics I connected with. They do a lot of work in informal settlements around housing, and they're one of few NGOs that work specifically with the urban poor, because a lot of organizations are still very much connected with rural poverty and issues of connected with that. So I met with them, and I told them that I was interested in looking at gender and disaster risk management, and what that entailed. I had some ideas from the literature, but wasn't entirely sure, but this is what I was thinking of doing. And I asked them if they were interested in that, if it would connect with their work, and they said it would be. And on the back of me kind of sharing my findings with them, they supported me by putting me in contact with local homeowner associations. So they're like an umbrella organization that helps to organize communities that are going to be affected by eviction, or affected more broadly by issues of disaster risk. So they put me in contact with communities that were interested to speak to me on the topic. And those initial conversations actually were the focus group discussions that I mentioned. So I conducted about 10 focus groups with men and women separately, as well as men and women together, to get a sense, of like the key issues. So these were very broad focus groups looking at questions of risk, at disaster, and gender relations, and equality more broadly, so that I could get a sense of what was actually important to people, and kind of on the back of that formulate what mattered. And I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, like the clear thing that came out of that was that it wasn't about disasters. So you go to the Philippines, even when I arrived, there was a typhoon. You go there expecting that people care about disasters in the kind of traditional sense. But what I took away from that and all the further conversations was that it was much more nuanced than that, and that people were more concerned with housing, and that there was a really intimate and very deeply political relationship between disasters and disaster risk management and housing insecurity. And so that's how I approached the kind of initial stages. And then on the back of that, and again, not wanting to define, I didn't want to define it too much, because you never know what you're looking for. Do you know what I mean? If you don't know what you're looking for, then how do you ask what you don't know that you're looking for? So to navigate that, I used photo voice. So I gave people cameras and asked them to tell me a story about anything. It was a bit of a risk, but I said, tell me a story about anything that's important to you, and take 5 pictures, and if they're connected or not, then that's fine. And I literally just sat down and people talked me through their photographs, and through that I got not only a sense of what was going on in their community, but about things so much broader kind of cultural perspective, a lot of discussions about religion, about animals, about really, really rich conversations with people. And I think through that, I asked some key questions around homeowner associations and such, which directed me to these findings. And then finally, kind of thinking about decoloniality and also, feminist kind of principles of research. So on top of doing the photo voice interviews and also just like life story narratives with those that weren't comfortable using cameras, I went back to the Philippines and have been back several times since those initial discussions and presented the findings back to them. We had workshops where we agreed with each other, disagreed with each other, kind of talked through the gender dynamics, the way that I was analyzing things, and just double checking, like, I presented everything that I've just presented to you, and we had a discussion about, does this fit? Does it not fit? Have I interpreted your results or your conversations accurately? And there were some interesting contentions there where people would initially say, these are the reasons why women participate more. And then I would come in and contradict that. And I would say, well, actually, this is what I think. And then it was a really interesting kind of back and forth there where we all, I think, learned a lot. And so, it's been transparency from the beginning. I'm still in, close contact with many of the men and women that I met out there. And I think that the methods, made this research. Obviously, it was the people who participated in their generosity and time, but I think using different kinds of methods that enable people who aren't literate in some cases, who speak different languages, who might have a different comfort in communicating in certain ways. I think the more diversity of options we can give people to tell their story the way that they want to tell it, the better, really. So that's a bit about my methods.
Thank you. You answer the following question, which was essentially about the responsibility of a researcher, not only to publish, but to evolve the research to the community to empower them with research. So being asked that question, I have another one, much more conceptual, that says, how do you define smart or resilient city as part of your research on risk? What are your main critiques to the mainstream definitions, if you have, and how your own conceptual reframing reject or adopt these definitions?
Yeah, thank you. It's something that I've thought about a lot, and I'm not super well versed, if I'm totally honest, in the smart city discussions, but I think they're important and interesting, and I'm increasingly moving into the space of like digital cities and what we can use, and actually trying to bridge the use of digital tech with more inclusive urban futures. And that speaks to the way that I define resilient cities or smart cities, and it's really grounded in a social justice perspective. It's grounded in my politics. It's about, how can we create opportunities for the many rather than the few, and what are we doing to minimize gaps between groups and to ensure kind of equity in resources, and I situate housing at the heart of that. I think housing is so fundamental to everything, that a lot of what I think we need to be focusing on in urban resilience initiatives, in sustainable development initiatives, has to be centered around where the majority live. And that tends to be in informal settlements. So a lot of my work is kind of grounded there, conceptually as well as practically. And to kind of speak to that, like how we approach that, I think we need to be using tech differently. I think tech can, as someone who's a bit of a technophobe, like tech can be a divider. It can be something that's used to keep people out. We use certain language, we use certain machinery. It might require a certain level of money or education to kind of navigate. But there are huge, huge possibilities of using tech in a way that actually helps to bring people in, that helps to expand the kinds of knowledge and ideas that we're using to make policy decisions, to understand how different groups navigate the city, experience the city. So I think, smart cities, in addition to making more kind of information available and connecting people, need to explicitly think about how they, as in the technology, are engaging with those who tend to be on the margins.
Thank you, Jordana. I would like to bring you to a different topic. I was particularly interested because Chile in general, we are quite exposed to all sort of natural disasters, including earthquakes, volcanoes, eruptions, and tsunamis, and so on. But, the
most beautiful countries often are.
Which give a very beautiful geography as well. But you mentioned in your study that discourses about risk management can be used politically, not just to solve the situation of people that are potentially affected for a future risk, but also not by just helping to the process of essentially accommodating land for the most profitable use, regardless of how that may affect and even reduce the quality of those that are displaced. So I would like you to get a little bit deeper in the case that you mentioned and how that may have affected, on the one side, the risk that these peoples are affected. I would say like natural risk, but as well the everyday risk that was your presentation about.
Yeah, no, thank you, Pablo. I think as a starting point, it's really important to situate. So I'm making that claim on the basis of the areas that I was working in. And in one of my papers, I go into a bit more depth about, I touched on it in the presentation, but the ways in which slums or like the informal settlement are often kind of the opposite. It's presented as the opposite of sustainable. It's presented as the opposite of like a resilient, environmentally green city, right? And these are narratives that are very distinct, but also neatly interwoven and often used in combination with one another towards this production of the ideal city, the ideal green, sustainable, resilient future city, right? And the Philippines is no exception to that. I think we do that even in London. So there are these ideas of what the city should be, and quite often these like greening initiatives. So riversides in the Philippines and everywhere in the world can often get really polluted. And if you have people living along the settlement, they're the first people to blame. And rather than looking in a kind of more nuanced and detailed way about at-risk management within these areas and like where the waste is coming from, and is it coming from, the fancy millionaire mansions upstream, or is it actually coming from the residents here? What ends up happening is that where waste, as an example, is located becomes the kind of grounds for eviction, for demolition, and so on. And so these narratives are being used regularly in the Philippines, and a friend and colleague, Maria Alvarez, writes about this extensively. So if this is something you're interested in, I think her work, which looks at like benevolent evictions, where you're doing people a favor, you're helping to rescue and save them from their environment or from themselves in some cases, being kind of used as an alternative narrative to legitimize the erasure of informal settlements. I think it's an important dynamic for us to be mindful of when we think about these competing, or sometimes not even competing political agendas, but like everyone benefits from a greener city. But the question is, you know, what violent processes are underpinning these interventions, and who suffers as a result. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's important to really think about, you know, where are you moving people to? And one of the papers that I shared with you, you know, to speak to this paradox, people are being moved from a high value area in the city center to a landslide prone area in the hills on the periphery of Cebu. That, I mean, it's questionable. Are they better off? Like, it's much more expensive for them to get to their livelihoods. Their houses are routinely affected by landslides. They're out in the hills, so nobody even sees it. You know, the emergency vehicles can't access them because they don't have roads. Like, so you're moving people, you know, under this guise of, you know, benevolent evictions and disaster risk management and clearing waterways so that you can develop high rises, but you're moving people to somewhere that's potentially, you know, much worse for them. So I think, again, it won't speak to every context, but I think the politics are important for us to be mindful of.
Great, Jordana. Thank you. I'm gonna move in something that Chileans, they are particularly interested about, and it is, what are the policy implications of your work? Okay, you mentioned several issues that women face and low-income population face when they essentially have to manage risk. Yeah. But one of the key, and I would say, like in academia, we are not very used to do that really essential reflection. We're much better at criticizing a particular process. But if you have to change, I don't know, 3-4 things, or give 3-4 policy recommendations about essentially the fieldwork experience and the type of everyday experiences that you mentioned in your research, which one would be these ones? And do you think that they are applicable only to Philippines, or is something that could travel more broadly?
It would be, I mean, people to own the
Jordana,
that they
apparently we have some problems. Jordana, if you can turn off your camera, I think it would stabilize the connection.
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you, yes.
You can hear me? I'll keep my camera off until it stabilizes. But I was going to say that I think housing, like I think the policy areas are not necessarily connected with disaster risk management, but with the broader externalities of things that exacerbate people's vulnerability when a big catastrophic event happens, right? So, and I'm not the first to kind of argue this. Like, I think everyone's been arguing this for centuries. Like, housing matters. It's really, really important. So I think we need to look at how we can give people security of tenure in a way that's meaningful for them, and actually have discussions about whether resettlement is the right thing, or whether there are ways to kind of, you know, put people rather than profit first. It's not easily done. I think, you know, the challenges of facing governments all around the world. It's not an easy one. But there are some really exciting and innovative initiatives that have been taking place even in Cebu around the government kind of financing land, and selling it back to the informal settlers at a discounted rate compared to the market price. Finding interventions around like housing financialization, I think that people can genuinely afford. I think this is where conversations need to be, rather than kind of always thinking to move people out. I think a second area is thinking about infrastructure. So again, I touch on this, but when we speak about the feminization of labor in a more general sense, and the ways in which this plays out on multiple scales in the context of urban poor communities, infrastructure, like having a tap with running water and potable water in your home, saves hours and hours of work and emotional anxiety and so on, so for both women and men, but specifically for women. So I think when we're thinking about, engendering our policies, there are some quite easy wins that can make a big difference to the lives of women and men, boys and girls that are particularly affected by different types of urban risk, and infrastructure is one of those. So prioritizing WASH infrastructure in particular, I think, has a big impact on things like fires and floods. So even though it's not explicitly connected, it is indirectly connected to issues of disaster risk management and resilience.
Thank you. Go ahead if you want.
Yeah, if I can add one more thing that's
sure.
a bit more connected to people that are involved in practice-oriented, community-based disaster risk management. I think we all have a tendency sometimes to equate participation of marginalized groups. And I say that, you can't see me, I can put my camera back on, but I'm using kind of inverted commas there. I think we need to think critically, but it's not just about being critical and criticizing participation. I think participation is good. The more people at the table, the better. But I think we need to not just take kind of bums in seats as a sign that people are empowered. And I think I've worked in NGOs for most of my life. I know that we tend to, pat ourselves on the back when you get different people in the room, but ourselves even further. And be asking who in which men and women are
apparently we are having some problems with the connection. Jordana, if you are still there. Let's give a minute for Jordana to...
There. Sorry about the internet.
Yeah, now
I'm
it's
here.
stable again.
Okay, that's great. I don't know what you caught from...
Essentially, we didn't hear anything, Jordana.
Going is unstable.
Yeah, now you are stable, I think. Again. Jordana? Okay.
Sorry, I don't know what's going on. Can you hear me now, Pablo?
Yeah, I can hear you. Jordana, we are almost on time. So I think if you want to essentially make a very short statement, maybe related with that, with the last question, or the last thing that you would like to say, that would be great before ending. Yeah, so
I don't know if you can hear me.
No.
Yeah, internet connection. At least it didn't happen in the middle of the presentation. But yeah, thank you all for participating and for being here, and your patience in these last few minutes with the connection issues. Yeah, and I'm happy to chat later. So if you want to get in touch by email, please do. And thank you for having me here.
Yeah, thank you, Jordana. It was a great presentation and a great conversation. We really enjoy it, and for us, I repeat, for the Institute of Housing, it's an honor to have you here. It's completely understandable. The problems with the internet is something that has happened to every one of us. And it's something that we are more used to than what we would like to. On that line, I thank you for the presentation, and for our next presentation would be Davide Luca. He's a lecturer at University of Cambridge, presenting la división urbano-rural y el descontexto político alrededor del mundo. And this presentation would be in 2 weeks. Follow the social media of INVI, and we will be essentially announcing this new presentation as well as sharing the link. Thank you again, Jordana. Take care.
Thank you.